The government shutdown continues, and the only thing everyone in Washington can agree on is that it's not their fault. Coming up, what the partial shutdown means to those in central Illinois and around the nation. Stay with us. At Issue starts now. For the first time in 17 years, the government is partially shut down. Hundreds of thousands of government workers are not earning a paycheck, and national parks are closed. While many might think a closure only affects those in our nation's capital, in reality, it can affect all of us. With more on the consequences of a closure, we're joined by Lakeland political science instructor Shane Rogers. So thank you so much for joining us. And as I mentioned in that brief little intro, this is the first one in 17 years. You remember the one 17 years ago quite well. You worked for Congressman Glenn Pichard at the time. So take us back 17 years and tell us what that was like and what you went through when you were working in that position.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be on again.
Sure.
I was working as a staff assistant, a new staff assistant to Congressman Glenn Pichard at the time. And so this was something new for me, and we hadn't been through a government shutdown for a while before that. So we were all kind of working our way through this. And at that time, it had to do with, in my opinion, something a little more concrete with budget and deficits and taxes. And the Republicans had just won substantial majorities in the House of Representatives, and they wanted to get a budget deficit plan through. And so it was very much related to, as I said, taxes and the budgetary process. And there just wasn't agreement between the Democrats and the Republicans and on how to get the deficit down. And so the government shut down at that time. I believe it was for about three and a half weeks, 21 days or so in there. And it was a tense time then as well, but we made it through it, and hopefully this one will work out the same.
You know, I don't think, me included, when you look at the big picture and all of it, most people don't really understand what a government shutdown is, or a partial government shutdown. So can you explain that and what leads to a shutdown? When I think of shutdown, I think the lights are off at the Capitol, the lights are off at the Dirksen building and all the other major buildings in this Capitol.
In some cases, that's exactly correct. You're right, it's not every shutdown happens for the same reasons I alluded to before. That one was more to do with budget deficits and disagreement on how to get that under control in 95, 96. And this one is not only about the repealing of Obamacare, which, you know, different sides are saying, well, that has to do with taxes and things because it spends money, and the other says no. But until they come to agreement on that, they've got into a partial shutdown. Is there a shutdown, a partial, all kind of a nomenclature that's only within the government. It's very confusing to the public at large who doesn't work in the government, because some are working, some are not. And in 94, 95, the terms essential and non-essential government employees came up. They've returned that so it wouldn't make people feel bad to now say expected and non-expected government employees. So some are open and some not.
Well, I was going to ask you. We hear that a lot: essential, non-essential, expected, non-expected. How is it determined who is expected and not expected, or important or not important, however you want to define it? Some people are going to work and getting paid, some are not. How is that determined? It's
an interesting process that is ongoing. That part of the government that we don't even see that continues to operate when the government is working. The Office of Management of Budget and Budget is part of the executive branch. And what they do is deal with budgetary matters, and they're the ones that really know where all the dollars and cents go in the national government's budget. And they can consistently do a review of each department before a government shutdown. So this is an ongoing process to figure out if ever there would be an emergency or a shutdown or something like that. They have their project managers of each department of the government have a review to figure out if something were to happen, who would be most essential and which ones would not be as essential in case there's a crisis or something. So it's not just a knee-jerk response of saying, okay, you stay, you go. That had been worked out previously in case there was something of a shutdown or an event that would lead to a government shakeup.
I think a lot of people that are out there watching, those that are in central Illinois, are asking, what does it have to do with me? There are so many different facets of areas that it affects and it doesn't affect. And I'd like to talk about some of those, because some of those areas are recreation, military, health, food safety, so many. So let's hit on a couple of those and maybe talk about, are they still operating? Are they not? Do people still have to pay their taxes? Mm-hmm. I would say probably so.
That would lead to an even worse
That would lead to
situation,
probably a worse
indeed.
situation. So talk about some of the things that are still going, some of the things that are not in operation right now.
And it could change, really hour by hour, because the longer this would go on, the more they may need to go into phase 2 or 3 of saying, okay, you were essential, you were not, but now we're moving on to a different phase of the situation. So the longer it goes on, the worse it could get for things that are open now. You're just not going to have as much money for later on. Currently, well, the United States military is getting paid, of course. They both agreed that that is an essential part of the government. But places like the passport agencies, national parks is always the one that gets mentioned the most. Those are closed, and obviously delays going on there. I believe they said the NASA is pretty much completely closed down.
Their channel is black.
And so literally the switch was turned off for a while. Mm-hmm. But it could be an ongoing flux situation, deciding, well, the longer it goes on, we may have to have more of that. And it will cause delays, and has. Anybody who's got a passport they're waiting on, or a trip that they want to plan, it could have some effects.
Well, here locally,
if it goes on longer.
Locally, as I'm a part of Newswatch, our nightly newscast, and we learned this week that the campgrounds at Lake Shelbyville, because they're government run by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that they were shut down. They were barricaded up, so if families had plans to go to Lake Shelbyville, the leaves will be turning soon. They have a big balloon fest that's planned at Lake Shelbyville, I believe next weekend.
Yeah.
They're looking at possibly having to move events because of things like that. So, and not only that, and I'm sure that you would agree, is in any facet that's shut down, it doesn't just affect that. So for instance, at Lake Shelbyville, there's campgrounds, but there's also businesses that survive based on the tourists and the campers that come into the lake.
Absolutely,
So.
that make their living just on the tourism and the people that come in. It does affect us. We don't always see immediately. It's been 2 days almost now. But the longer it goes on, those seem like small delays, but they upset the whole process later on. We had a career day at Lakeland College yesterday, and State Senator Chapin Rose came in and was talking to the students, and I said, well, just kind of in passing, I said, well, you're open today here to come to talk? And he got into a little discussion with me about, and this happens in government as well, a bridge that had been locked and shut down. I forget which town it was, but it was impassable because of that. But it was the only bridge or essential road to get people, if they were sick or needed an ambulance, to the hospital. And so he said, we've got to call in to find the key to this bridge. So just little, things like that on a county road,
right,
could cause some disruption that, again, we don't see every day, but it's not like a national park, but it could be just as dire circumstance.
How long could this go on, and how much is it costing America each day that this partial shutdown continues?
I think the last one I said went on for three and a half weeks, and I had looked up some numbers. To today's cost, it would be about $2 billion of what that cost our economy in 1996, 95, 96. Today, it's roughly estimated that it could cost up to $300 million a day. I just don't think, according to all the polls on both sides, political, non-political, that this thing can be going on too much longer. It's just the political will not be there for the people back home to stand for it, and it's
Party
going to be
lines
tough.
are drawn. So
Yeah.
how can the two sides come to an agreement? Is it solely based on Obamacare? Is this the mountain that can't be crossed? I know we've heard of piecemeals. You know, there's been some haggling on, well, if we approve, you know, opening state parks or reinstating some of the veteran services. Do you see a piecemeal agreement in place before the done deal is made again?
Well, I believe today I just heard before we came down here that the White House has called congressional leaders to the White House to meet at 5 or 5:30 or something. Not to negotiate necessarily, but to kind of figure out how to get forward from here. It is about Obamacare for both sides, but I think in the larger context, it's about much more. It's about how you govern. And I think both sides can agree this is no way to govern. And we just need to get past that. And we can always talk about, you know, the funding and of Obamacare and the governing of that, but you have to govern to do that, and that's what's completely stopped.
Now, this interview will air a couple of different times, and it's quite possible after we leave here today that the government will open again. How long does it? I mean, does somebody just flip a switch and the press starts running again and checks are printed again? I mean, I can't imagine it's a quick process. So if it ends today, how long will it be before parks are back open and clinical health trials start again and food safety inspections start again, and you know, all of those things that are idle right now?
That's a good question, and surprisingly, as inefficient as a lot of people see our government operating or not operating sometimes, it can be very efficient. The White House press secretary today said, you know, if they could come to an agreement even today, it could be open by dinner time. And not so much just flip a switch and come on. But they do, remember, they do plan for essential and non-essential people before something like this happens. So it would be relatively quickly that they could get things moving again. But I think the longer it goes on, the more decisions they would have to make, and that slows the process down of reopening. So hopefully it won't be much longer.
I know, you know, Eastern Illinois University, the University of Illinois, there are some federal grants that those institutions get. Is the shutdown impacting community colleges at all on the local level, being Parkland, Lakeland?
Sure, in much the same way. More to do with funding, federal grants, or just, again, things you don't see every day in operation, but because those are not part of permanent law. Those are things are fluctuating all the time, and a lot of that filters down from the national government to the states to the local communities. So if it stops in the middle, you know, it's got past the national down to the state, but not quite down to the lower level yet. You know, again, that could disrupt the process even longer because it's stuck.
Grants for students?
Certainly.
I mean, that's financial aid that's on the table,
Yeah.
and right now students they struggle to get that needed money for their education, so that's something that they struggle with too. Do you see an end in sight? I mean, given all the research and the studying and the watching that you have done, do you see that this could end soon?
Eventually, I think I was thinking of a quote by Prime Minister Winston Churchill when he said, "The Americans will always get it right after they've tried everything else." And so we've not tried everything else yet, but we've been through shutdowns before. They were proven not to be a good way to govern, and one side or the other is not going to get all the blame. They're going to share it. And again, I just don't think that people are going to tolerate as much this time as they did last time. I cannot see it going on for that long, of 21 days again. It's just, I don't think it's political viable for either party. And hopefully, and I think it's encouraging now that the White House is having this meeting and the congressional leaders are coming to talk, that's at least a step in the right direction. If they had done that a little more before, perhaps we wouldn't be in this situation.
Well, this battle, once it's over, there's another battle that awaits the country, and that is the debt ceiling. And that has not improved at all. How do you foresee what's happening right now playing into the next battle in our nation's capital, which is that?
Well, that's a good question, and that's why I try to say it's a larger context of not only about Obamacare, but what is it, by the 14th or 17th of October, somewhere around there, the debt ceiling needing to be raised or not. That's got to be part of the discussions. We can't go right up to the next day. This is a serious situation, but that's talking about the whole credit of the whole nation, and nobody knows what will happen exactly. We know it's going to be so bad, but how bad is that? It's never happened before. And the economy would just tank or take 10, 20 more years to recover. Not only ours, but around the world. So it's something we just shouldn't even be messing with.
Well, and you had mentioned the cost of the shutdown per day. How is that money made up? If that's even the right way to define that or ask that, is the all of that. How is that? Yeah. How did they catch up to that?
It's a good question. There's really two main ways: either cutting spending or raising revenue, raising taxes. I mean, those are the two most simplistic ways. And of course, neither side wants to agree on that. That's partially why we're heading toward that fiscal cliff again. Our nation's economy overall is about $15.7 trillion. And so when I mentioned 300 million a day, that seems relatively small, fraction of a percent of what this shutdown would cost. The defaulting on the money that you've already spent to other nations, to the programs for all people in the United States, defaulting on that, it would be tough to calculate the cost. But those would be the two ways of having to deal with it. But how much would you have to raise? How much would you have to cut? It's a debate that I think would be far tougher than this one. If they can't solve this, and we're talking about a fraction of a percent of a budget, it's just tough to even calculate, I think. So I hope we don't get there.
Can we go back and maybe talk about the process a little bit, where how many times can they vote? How often can they vote? Maybe membership in the House versus the Senate as far as the Democratic members and the Republican members, and that's really a sticking point too, because there's a lot of party voting going on. So can you talk about that as far as how often are the legislators called in, and who speaks and who doesn't speak before a vote is taken?
Good question, because the schedule is determined by both the House and Senate leaders. The president can call Congress back into session when he wants, but that's rarely done. And they have tried to, there's been some politics on both sides by saying, well, the House was working on the weekend, but the Senate wasn't, and whatnot. But they set their own schedules. They can vote as many times as they want, on as much as they want. And that's sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing in the process, because straw men can be set up and say, well, we're going to vote on that. Well, is that wasting time when you know it's not going to pass? Are you trying to make a political point? Let's get down to what would solve the problem. But they could be there 24 hours a day. They're getting paid. Congressional salaries
they are getting paid.
are being
they
met.
are getting their
That
checks.
is part of the permanent law as essential services. If they were to just go home, they're needed in the process to get it going. So that's a lot of people don't like it when they're saying they're getting paid, and I can understand it. Some I believe has said we're not going to take a paycheck until we get this resolved, but it's up to the individual member.
Why do you believe Obamacare is such the sticking point in this matter when there's all those other issues that are out there? There are legislators that are very strong, pro and against this program. What do you see as the main issue with this health care plan?
It's a unique political situation in our government that it's a complicated law, huge law, and it affects every part of, society in a way, because it's dealing with livelihood, our health, and everybody gets sick or has to visit the doctor at one point. And it's a major change. And not all parts of it are known how it's going to work. Not all parts of it do we have the exact cost. So there's a lot of questions out there to be made and answered. And I think we just have to have the process play out. It is the law. It passed. Both houses went through the process, upheld by the court. Let's see how it works. And if it doesn't work, that's why we have elections. And people will ask later to, recall that process and work out something different. But I think we're kind of getting ahead of knowing how it will work yet.
Or how it's
only
going
been
to
one
be,
day.
or how it's going to be funded.
Right.
Frankly, because it's a. When you look at it basically, there's the platinum plan, the gold plan, and the silver
Right.
plan, if I'm defining it correctly. And anyone that does not have health insurance, if you are employed, you are required to get this health insurance. I think the question that is out there by a lot of people is, how am I going to pay for it? Let's say that I'm working in a restaurant, a bookstore, and I don't work very many hours a week, but I do file my taxes, which means if I'm a filing taxpayer, I have to apply for this health insurance or face fines come March or April 1 of next year. So I think a lot of people are wondering, how do I pay for this? How am I going to afford? I can't put food on the table. How am I going to afford this?
Right.
So that's the struggle that people are. And I know when the program launched online, there were some hiccups.
Yeah.
I think so many people tried to get online to look at it, to enroll, and they couldn't. So.
Yeah, we know there's vast interest in the law. I think it was 3 million people tried to go to the website, and there were even questions, as you mentioned. Were there glitches in the whole system already, or was it just overloaded? And they said, well, we don't know yet. We'll have to find out and see over the next 2 or 3 days to see if that was part. So there's going to be problems, as there were with other major programs. We're talking about a huge change that's going to affect 300, some odd million people. So not everything's going to go off without a hitch. Lastly, or on that point anyway, when I said it affects how you're governing, that's going to be a part with the fiscal cliff or the debt crisis later on as well. They've got to find some common ground because you mentioned, is it about Obamacare? It is about Obamacare, but it could be about any law that's passed. The president can come back and say, well, I'm not going to open up the government until you guys vote this way on that. And, pick each piece of legislation. And this thing could just go back and forth. Obamacare is the focus right now because it's been the focus for the last 2 years. But it could really be about any piece of legislation that they've ever passed in the government, if the president or the Congress wanted to make this big of a deal over it. So they got to figure out how to stop that and work together because it could be about anything.
We've got a few seconds left. What's the last thing that you can tell Central Illinois about what's happening in our government and what they should know?
Well, I would say, I would encourage them. They are a part of the process. We must remember Congress and our government is a reflection of us. The good parts, the bad parts, and unless we write, call, participate, put the pressure on our elected representatives to get a response, we're not going to get a response that we like or need. Not that we always do anyway, but we're part of that process as well. And we are being affected if we participate or not, because decisions will be made. So we need to do that.
Need to have our voice heard. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Rogers, for joining us. I really appreciate it. And if there is a topic that you would like discussed here on At Issue, contact us at weiu@weiu.net. For At Issue, I'm your host, Kelly Rundle.